Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The scent of blood in the air. Scary story, published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The First Whiff. A light mist hung in the night air, softening the edges of a small, weathered town nestled at the edge of a dense forest. Twisted trees lined the streets, their bare branches scratching the sides of crumbling old houses and shops that hadn't seen a new coat of paint in decades. Shadows slipped through the alleys, melting into the cracked sidewalks and rusted street lamps, casting a dim, yellow glow over the town square. No one spoke of it aloud, but every local knew there was a haunting quiet to the town, a silence that felt more like a waiting. The protagonist, let's call him Ethan, paced down the empty street alone, his footsteps echoing off the walls of boarded-up buildings and neglected storefronts. He'd moved here for peace and simplicity, looking for an escape from the bustling noise of his past. But tonight, the air felt different, like something was hanging just out of reach, crawling at the edges of his senses. The cold October wind bit into his skin, carrying a faint, metallic tang that he couldn't quite place. Then it hit him, the unmistakable scent of blood. It came in quick, sharp, and unsettling, like a brief slap in the face. Ethan stopped mid-step, breathing shallowly, his mind racing. Maybe it was rust, or just the lingering smell of wet earth. But as he moved forward, the scent clung to the air, faint but persistent, as though the wind had brought it just for him. He swallowed, the taste almost metallic on his tongue. Maybe it's just nothing, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The smell drifted away, and he exhaled, relieved. But later, as he walked back to his house, the scent returned, stronger this time. It was closer, invading his senses with the sickly sweet sharpness of blood, souring his stomach and making his pulse quicken. Back home, he scrubbed his hands, cleaned every surface he could, trying to convince himself that it was just something he'd picked up along the way. Yet, as he lay in bed, the smell seemed to linger in his mind, sinking into the shadows of his thoughts. The quiet room felt oppressive, the air too thick, too still. He closed his eyes, but the scent was there, embedded in the dark. He couldn't escape it, couldn't forget it. And with that unsettling scent hanging in the air, he knew sleep would not come easily. Chapter 2. The haunting scent grows stronger. The morning light slid through Ethan's curtains, casting his room in a soft haze, but sleep had never come. He tossed and turned all night, the strange scent lingering in his thoughts, refusing to let go. Finally, he dragged himself out of bed, hoping a hot shower would clear his head. But as soon as he stepped into the steam-filled bathroom, there it was, again, a faint, coppery tang creeping through the air, seeming to seep from the walls. He swallowed hard, the taste of it making him feel nauseous. Trying to shake it off, he hurried to get ready for work, scrubbing his hands as if that would make a difference. Yet, as he slid into his car, the smell intensified, filling the cramped interior. He rolled down the window, but the fresh air barely helped. Ethan's eyes scanned the seats, the dash, the floor, even though he knew he'd find nothing. Frustration bubbled up inside him. This wasn't normal, wasn't something he could brush off. Clenched the steering wheel, feeling the heat of his own pulse beneath his fingertips. The scent followed him to work, gnawing at his concentration, thickening around him like a fog. His coworkers' voices faded in and out as he tried to push the smell away, but it stayed, persistent and sharp, burrowing into his senses. His boss, a wiry woman with keen eyes, gave him a concerned look. "You look a little off, Ethan," she remarked, tilting her head. "Everything all right?" He nodded quickly, too quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Just a rough night," he muttered, brushing it off. But he could feel her eyes on him as he walked away. It wasn't until lunchtime that he noticed the old man standing by the edge of the parking lot, watching him intently. The man's eyes were sunken and dark, his face weathered, but something about him struck Ethan as familiar, almost like he'd seen him in a dream. He was drawn to approach, as if pulled by an invisible thread. "You smell it, don't you?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Ethan froze. Before he could respond, the man's eyes glinted with a strange recognition. "The scent remembers," he whispered, his voice fading as he turned away, vanishing around the corner of the building. Ethan's heart raced, pounding in his ears. He felt the weight of those words pressing down on him, the scent of blood growing stronger with each breath. Chapter 3: Unwanted Memories Resurface. Ethan sat on his couch, staring at the empty space where the old man had stood just hours before. The scent remembers. The words clung to his thoughts like cobwebs, sticky and unsettling. Every breath seemed to bring that metallic tang closer, sharper. He rubbed his temples, fighting off a headache as he tried to make sense of it. How could a scent remember anything? What was he even supposed to remember? His eyes drifted to a stack of dusty boxes tucked into the corner of his living room. He hadn't touched them since the move, barely glanced at them since he'd left his old life behind. But tonight, something in them called to him. Slowly, he pulled the first box open, coughing as a cloud of dust rose into the air. Old photos and journals, loose papers and letters, all jumbled together. His fingers brushed against the edge of a faded photograph, pulling it out gently. The image was of a dark room he didn't recognize, the details too blurry to make out, but it sparked a flash of memory. He saw shadows, his own shadow, elongated and trembling, and heard a faint, muffled sound, almost like crying. The scent of blood filled his nostrils suddenly, as strong and thick as if someone had poured it across the pages of the photo. He dropped it, stumbling back, his heart pounding. This was more than just paranoia. Something was surfacing, something he'd buried long ago. He spent the night combing through more photos and journals, hoping for a clear answer. But every image, every scribbled note, seemed to drag him deeper into fragments of things he could barely remember. A word here, a room there, the faint sound of footsteps behind him. None of it made sense, yet the scent grew sharper with each new piece, weaving through the scattered memories. It was past midnight when his phone rang, shattering the silence. The number was blocked, the line crackling like a distant thunderstorm. Ethan's hands shook as he brought the phone to his ear. "Stop looking," a voice whispered, the words slow and deliberate. "Forget what happened." The call disconnected, leaving Ethan staring into the darkened screen, breathless. Fear and determination battled within him. Forget. But one thing was certain, he couldn't stop now. He had to uncover whatever haunted his past, even if it meant facing something he'd tried so desperately to bury. Chapter 4: The Descent into Obsession. Ethan could feel it slipping. The thin thread of normalcy he'd managed to cling to was unraveling fast. His world had shrunk, and in its place was the constant, inescapable presence of that haunting scent. Friends, once warm and welcoming, now eyed him with a cautious distance. They'd noticed his restless glances, his muttered phrases about memories he couldn't place, and the way he seemed to stare into spaces no one else could see. He could feel them pulling away, and part of him didn't blame them. Even his girlfriend, the one steady force in his life, had reached her limit. "It's like you're not even here anymore, Ethan," she'd said one evening, frustration and worry carving lines into her face. "You're lost in whatever this is. I can't keep watching you like this." She packed a bag, and left that night, leaving Ethan alone with the silence, the memories, and a lingering scent of blood. Now, his days blurred together, each one feeling like a descent further into shadow. He stayed up late, combing through dusty journals and old letters until his eyes burned. No photograph or scribbled note could answer the question burning in his mind. The scent lingered, taunting him, creeping into every corner of his life. One morning, he woke to find a faint stain on his pillow, a rusty red smear that vanished the moment his fingers brushed over it, leaving him wondering if it had even been there. It wasn't just the pillow. A book he'd pulled from his shelf opened to a random page, revealing a faint stain along the edge, almost invisible but unmistakable. He scrubbed his hands, checking them over and over, as if he could somehow cleanse himself of this presence that clung to him. Driven by desperation, he began to look outside his own understanding. Late nights saw him diving into books about spirits and the supernatural, a topic he'd once dismissed as fantasy. He even consulted a local medium, who warned him cryptically that some things can't be forgotten, they demand to be seen. On the final night of his search, he found an old map, worn and faded, of a place he hadn't thought of in years, a small cabin, deep in the woods where he'd once spent summers as a child. He had buried memories of that place for a reason. But now, as the scent of blood intensified, he knew he had to go back. Whatever truth haunted him was waiting in that cabin, where the shadows of his past remained, waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 5. The Return to the Source. Ethan gripped the wheel as he drove out of town, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. The forest grew denser with every mile, the trees twisting overhead to form a thick canopy, blotting out the sun. Shadows deepened, stretching long fingers across the road. Memories he'd pushed deep into the recesses of his mind rose like ghosts, haunting each mile closer he got to the old family cabin. He hadn't been here in years. Even when his parents sold it, he'd felt an odd relief, as if leaving it behind would erase the half-formed memories lurking in its walls. But now, as he pulled up the narrow dirt path and parked in front of the cabin's weathered frame, the relief was gone. Only dread remained, coiled tight in his chest. The cabin looked almost the same, paint chipped, shutters hanging at awkward angles, the front steps creaking under his weight as he walked up. The silence around him felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He hesitated at the door, hand trembling as he reached for the rusty handle, the familiar scent of blood thickening in the air, sharp and overwhelming. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, dust hung in the stillness, illuminated by thin beams of light slipping through cracked windows. The furniture remained untouched, covered in sheets that sagged like the forgotten faces of the past. The scent of blood was everywhere now, a suffocating presence that seemed to pulse in the walls. Ethan swallowed hard, stepping deeper inside, his eyes scanning the room for anything that felt familiar. In the corner, half buried beneath a pile of old papers, he spotted a toy truck, smeared with something dark and dried along its edges. He picked it up, feeling a prickling at the back of his mind, like a memory waiting just out of reach. As he set the truck down, his eyes landed on a newspaper clipping pinned beneath it. Faded and crumpled, the headline sent a jolt through him. Local child goes missing, foul play suspected. The fragmented memories snapped into focus. A hot summer day, laughter echoing in the trees, then screaming. He remembered standing there, frozen, as red soaked the ground. The scent of blood had been thick in the air, just like now. His breath hitched as a realization broke over him, cold and unforgiving. He'd been there. He'd seen it happen, or, worse, he'd been part of it. Trembling, he stumbled back, clutching the edge of a table for support, the fragments of memory piecing together a past he could no longer escape. The blood, the scent, the guilt, they'd all returned, demanding he remember the truth. Chapter 6. Confronting the Ghosts of the Past. Ethan's pulse raced as the memories sliced through him, sharp, vivid, undeniable. He'd been there that day, his hands trembling, the scent of blood thick and fresh in the summer air. His younger brother Jake had been there too. A game gone wrong, a stumble, a fall. Jake's laughter had turned to a choked cry, his eyes wide with fear as he tumbled down the rocky hill behind the cabin. Ethan remembered looking into those eyes, frozen by panic, unable to help, unable to save him. And then nothing. Just darkness. The cabin's dim interior seemed to pulse, the walls breathing, the shadows elongating and twisting, as if alive. The scent of blood was suffocating now, a heavy fog pressing against him from all sides. He stumbled back, feeling it seep through the cracks in the wood, as if the cabin itself bled with the memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Suddenly, a low, whispering sound drifted through the room. At first, it was too faint to make out, a distorted murmur weaving through the silence. But then it grew louder, each syllable clear and cold, his name stretched in a mocking whisper. Ethan, Ethan. He whirled around, searching the shadows, but found nothing. The walls began to ripple, the shadows bending and twisting, revealing faint, ghostly outlines. Jake's figure appeared before him, his young face pale and expressionless, his eyes staring straight into Ethan's, filled with the same fear he'd seen that day. Jake, his voice cracked, the weight of guilt heavy on his tongue. Jake's image flickered, his lips parting to speak, but instead of words, a blood-curdling scream erupted, filling the cabin, bouncing off every wall, shrill and unending. Ethan clamped his hands over his ears, his heart racing, but the scream only grew louder, ringing in his bones, echoing the terror he'd ignored all these years. The walls around him seemed to close in, the air thickening, each breath harder than the last. Shadows stretched from the floor, reaching for him with elongated skeletal fingers. Blood oozed from between the floorboards, spreading across the floor in dark, glistening pools, crawling toward his feet. Desperation clawed at his mind. The realization hit him like a wave he could no longer run from the truth. This was his fault. He had left his brother there, alone and helpless, too afraid to face the consequences. And now, he was haunted by the memory he'd buried. Trembling, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Jake. I was scared. I didn't mean for any of it to happen." The shadows paused, the cabin seeming to hold its breath. Jake's figure remained still, his eyes fixed on Ethan, and for a brief moment, the bloodstains faded, the air lightened. But Ethan could feel the weight of his actions pressing down, a truth he couldn't erase. He took a deep breath, accepting the horror, letting it wash over him. And as he did, the scent of blood began to dissipate, leaving only silence and a profound, unbearable emptiness behind. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. Ethan stood at the center of the cabin, his heart thudding in his chest as the shadows writhed around him. The air was thick, suffocating, and every breath he took seemed to pull the very essence of fear deeper into his lungs. The bloodstains were gone, but the oppressive weight of guilt and terror remained, clinging to the room like an unseen presence. Jake's ghostly figure still hovered in the corner, eyes locked onto Ethan with that unblinking stare, as if daring him to face what he had done. There was no turning back now. Ethan had come this far, through every whispered voice, every flash of memory, and he knew what he had to do. He set the ritual into motion, each movement deliberate, steady, as if by sheer will he could control the storm inside his own mind. Candles flickered in the corners of the room, their flames casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. The air hummed with a tension so thick it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath. He had to face it. The past, the terror, the blood, The entity that had haunted him for so long, the thing he had buried, refusing to confront, to remember. Taking a deep breath, Ethan closed his eyes and began to speak the words, the chant he'd learned from the old book. His voice was shaky at first, but with each word, his resolve solidified. He had no choice but to break free of this haunting, this never-ending nightmare that had ruined his life. The air grew colder, and the smell of blood thickened, turning the very fabric of the room into a palpable entity, almost suffocating. The scent clung to him, heavy and rancid, as if it were not just in the air, but woven into his very being. It pulled him back into the moment when it all began, the day Jake had died. The fall, the scream, his helplessness, the horror of knowing that he had turned away. Suddenly, the figure of Jake was standing before him, no longer a flicker but real, solid, the blood on his clothes fresh, his eyes wide with accusation. "You did this, Ethan," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening silence. Ethan's knees buckled as the weight of his brother's death pressed down on him. But he didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, Jake. I couldn't save you then, but I'll save myself now." The shadows twisted violently, and the air seemed to crackle with dark energy. Ethan's heart raced as he forced himself to look directly at the figure of his brother. He had to accept it, to stop running. With the final words of the chant spilling from his lips, Ethan felt the walls around him shudder, the air growing still. The blood smell lifted, fading into nothingness. The room quieted, and with it, the heavy presence of guilt dissipated, leaving him exhausted, but somehow, finally, free. As the final breath of the past left him, Ethan sank to his knees. The cabin was silent. The haunting was over. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Lingering Shadows. The morning after, the air felt different. Lighter. The forest stood still, almost reverent in its silence, as if holding its breath for something. He looked at the place he'd once feared, the place that had held him captive for so long, and for the first time, he felt nothing but a deep, aching exhaustion. The nightmare was over. The cabin, his family's legacy of fear, was nothing more than an empty shell. But it wasn't the same world he returned to. The sun was brighter, the trees greener, the birds louder. Yet there was a shadow on him, something that couldn't be shaken. The weight of everything he had faced, the memories, the horrors, the blood lingered, not in the air, but in his soul, like a scar that would never heal, no matter how much time passed. Back in the city, Ethan tried to return to his normal life. He went through the motions, the same job, the same apartment, the same daily routine. But something had shifted. He looked at people differently now, like he could see the cracks beneath their surfaces, like he understood the quiet desperation in their eyes. The blood in his past, in the walls of that cabin, had changed him in ways he couldn't yet name. At night, when he closed his eyes, he sometimes felt the weight of the air pressing down on him again, as though the cabin's blood-soaked walls were still alive, still waiting to consume him. He would wake up, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. But when he'd turn on the lights, everything seemed fine. Except for the faint traces, the whispers, the shadows. One night, as he walked to his car, a sharp breeze cut through the air. He froze. There, just beyond the trees, the scent of blood familiar, suffocating, suddenly filled his nostrils. His stomach churned. The smell was real, undeniable, like the wind had carried it from the very heart of the cabin. He whirled around, but the street was empty. No one in sight. The trees swayed gently, their leaves rustling as if to mock his unease. A fresh bloodstain appeared on his car's windshield, blotching the glass. It wasn't there before. It couldn't have been. Ethan wiped his brow, his breath ragged. It's just a memory, he told himself. But as the wind picked up again, swirling around him, he heard something faint whispers, like a distant echo. Ethan! He froze, eyes wide, every hair on his body standing on end. He turned, but there was nothing there. The scent of blood lingered in the air, a promise that maybe, just maybe, the haunting had only just begun.